The first light of dawn breaks hesitantly over western waters, as if uncertain whether to pierce the veil that hangs between sea and sky. Silver fog rolls across ancient tides, thick and luminous, concealing what lies beyond, or perhaps revealing something the waking world has long forgotten. In this liminal hour, when night surrenders to day, but darkness has not yet departed, the boundary between what is real and what is remembered grows thin as gossamer. Fishermen once spoke of mornings like these with hushed reverence. They would guide their boats carefully, through waters they knew by heart, yet on certain days marked by no calendar, predicted by no almanac, the mist would shift in ways that defied the wind. Shapes would emerge that matched no coastline they recognized. The cry of gulls would sound distant, then impossibly near, as if the birds themselves were caught between two worlds. And in those moments, the old ones said, you might glimpse what was never meant to be seen by mortal eyes. They called it Avalon, the beyond the mists. Not west or east, not north or south, but somewhere perpendicular to the compass rose, existing in a direction the human mind struggles to name. A place where apple trees bloom eternally in impossible orchards, where 9 sisters tend to wounds that run deeper than flesh, where a wounded king sleeps beneath hills of green glass, waiting for a call that may never come or has already come 1,000 times unheard. The legends speak of this isle in whispers, as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile magic keeps it hidden from the world of maps and measurements. Medieval monks wrote of it with trembling hands, describing paradise in terms that blended Christian heaven with far older dreams. Celtic bards sang of it beside fires that have long since turned to ash, their melodies preserved in languages that no longer grace living tongues. And still, across centuries of skepticism and science, the name persists, Avalon, carried forward on the wind of human longing. But what if the mist that conceals this legendary isle is not merely metaphor? What if, in ages past, there truly existed places where geography conspired with belief to create spaces that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time? Islands surrounded by marshes so vast and fogs so dense that to reach them was to pass through a natural veil, emerging into a world that felt somehow apart from the ordinary realm of human struggle. The story of Avalon begins here, in the silver space between certainty and mystery, where the careful historian meets the dreaming poet, and neither can fully explain what the other sees in the shifting fog. Language is memory's most faithful keeper. Long after kingdoms crumble and monuments fall, words remain, carrying within their syllables the echoes of worlds that have vanished. The name Avalon arrives in our present age freighted with such echoes, a linguistic vessel containing cargo far older than the word itself suggests. In the Welsh tongue, the phrase Ynys Avalon translates directly as Isle of Apples, a simple agricultural reference that somehow transcends its humble origins to suggest something far more potent. The apple, after all, is never merely fruit in the symbolic language of ancient peoples. It is the orb that contains immortality in Norse legend, the forbidden knowledge in Eden's garden, the golden prize that sparked the Trojan War. To name an island for apples is to name it for transformation, for the boundary between mortal and divine. Geoffrey of Monmouth, that 12th century chronicler, whose work dances so artfully between history and fantasy, wrote of a insula Avalonis in his Latin chronicles, the island of Avalon where Arthur sword Excalibur was forged, and to which the dying king would be born after his final battle. Geoffrey's Latin transforms the Welsh Afal into Avalo, lending the name Roman gravity while preserving its Celtic soul. But even Geoffrey, for all his elaborate detail, seems to be reaching back towards something older, a name already ancient when he set it down in ink. Some scholars trace the root further, still to a Proto-Celtic word that meant not just apple, but specifically the fruit as symbol of the otherworld, that realm the Celts believed existed parallel to our own, separated only by thin places where the veil might be crossed. In Irish mythology, this otherworld was called many names: Tir na Nog, Mag Mel, Emain Ablek, the last meaning, Isle of Apple Trees, a direct parallel to Avalon that suggests a shared cultural memory spanning the Celtic regions. The Romans, encountering these British and Gallic legends, sometimes identified Avalon with their own mythic Fortunate Isles, the Insulae Fortunatae, where heroes dwelt in eternal spring beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Did they recognize in the Celtic stories echoes of their own ancestral myths? Or did they impose their own understanding onto beliefs they couldn't fully grasp? What remains undeniable is how the name itself seems to hold power. Avalon, even spoken in modern English, divorced from its ancient context, carries a certain music. The soft opening vowel, the liquid L, the falling intonation, the word itself sounds like mist rolling across water, like something simultaneously present and just beyond reach. Meanwhile, in the centuries after Geoffrey, the name would spread through Arthurian romances, each retelling adding new layers of meaning, while the core remained constant. Avalon as threshold, as refuge, as the place with a mortal and immortal touch. French troubadours sang of it. German poets wove it into their verses. By the time Malory compiled his Morte d'Arthur in the 15th century, Avalon had become so embedded in the cultural imagination of Europe that its reality seemed beyond question, though what kind of reality, precisely, remained beautifully unclear. The name endures because it names something for which we have no other word, a place that might be physical or spiritual, historical or eternal, lost to the past or waiting still in some unmapped present. Geography is often considered the most concrete of sciences. Coastlines measured, mountains surveyed, distances calculated with precision. Yet the map of early Britain was nothing like the fixed certainty we know today. It was a fluid, changing landscape where water and land engaged in an ancient, slow-motion negotiation, and what was island one century might be connected land the next. Picture the Somerset levels as they existed 1,500 years ago, not the drained farmland of today, but a vast wetland ecosystem that flooded seasonally, transforming hills into islands surrounded by glittering, treacherous expanses of water and marsh. The Tor at Glastonbury rose from these waters like a beacon, a conical hill visible for miles. Its slopes crowned with what locals insisted were ancient fortifications, or perhaps something older still. To reach such places in winter required specialized knowledge paths through the marsh that only locals knew, channels that shifted with seasons and tides. Travelers approaching these island hills would have seen them appear and disappear in morning mists, seeming to float between earth and sky. Is it any wonder that such places became associated with otherworldly powers, with goddesses and hidden kingdoms? Bardsey Island, off the coast of North Wales, presents another compelling candidate. Known in Welsh as Ynys Enlli Island of Currents, this windswept scrap of land sits where wild tides create conditions that have claimed countless vessels. Medieval tradition held that 20,000 saints were buried there, and that the island was the final resting place of Merlin himself. The currents that guard Bardsey's shores create mists so dense and unpredictable that even modern sailors approach with caution. In centuries past, when navigation relied on coastal landmarks, such an island might appear and vanish seemingly at will. Further west, on the Brittany coast, the legend of Ys tells of a city swallowed by the sea, a kingdom so beautiful, so advanced, that when the waves claimed it, the loss was mourned for generations. Could Avalon and Ys be different names for the same cultural memory? Or did the Celtic peoples of Britain and Brittany, connected by sea routes and shared language, simply understand that their world contained places where the ordinary rules did not quite apply? The coast of Cornwall offers its own mysteries. The Isles of Scilly, now a scattered archipelago, were once connected by land that now lies beneath the waves. Archaeological evidence proves that a significant landmass existed there in prehistoric times, drowned by rising sea levels. Local legend preserves the name Lioness for this lost land, describing it as a fertile plain of 140 churches, claimed by the sea in a single catastrophic night. But perhaps Avalon was never a single location at all. Perhaps it was a concept that multiple places embodied, and a sacred island that could be reached only by those who knew the way, who understood the tides and mists, who carried the proper offerings or intentions. The Celtic world was one of fluid boundaries, where the spiritual and physical interpenetrated constantly. An island that served as a healing sanctuary, a place of goddess worship, a refuge for old ways as new religions advanced. Any such place might earn the name Avalon in local memory. As Christianity spread through Britain, many of these sacred islands were claimed by the new faith. Monasteries rose on ancient sacred sites. Saints' lives were written to echo and replace the older stories. The physical places remained, but their meanings shifted, were rewritten, or sometimes preserved in careful disguise within the new narratives. The map of Britain may show no Avalon, but the landscape remembers nonetheless, in place names and local legends, in the mists that still gather over ancient waters on certain mornings when the boundary between then and now grows thin. The story of Arthur's final journey has been told countless times, yet each telling circles back to the same haunting image. A boat drifting across still water, bearing a mortally wounded king toward an island that exists somewhere beyond the edge of the known world. The Battle of Camlan Fratricide, written in blood, had ended Arthur's dream of unity. Brother had fought brother, knight against knight, and the battlefield lay thick with Britain's fallen heroes. Arthur himself had dealt the killing blow to Mordred. Whether son or nephew, the legends cannot agree, but in doing so, received a wound that would not cease its bleeding. Not the clean death of a warrior, but a slow draining away, a fading between heartbeats. Geoffrey of Monmouth, in his Vita Merlini, written around 1150, describes the scene with poetic precision. 3 queens appeared Morgan, most skilled in the healing arts, and her sisters, to bear Arthur away in a boat that moved without oars or sail, propelled by intention rather than wind. As the vessel left the shore, the king's sword Excalibur was returned to the lake from which it came, a hand rising from the water to receive it 3 times, culling the blade beneath the surface into mystery. The destination, Avalon, the island of apples, where, according to Geoffrey, 9 mystical women possessed knowledge of healing beyond mortal understanding. They would tend Arthur's wounds in orchards that bloomed eternally, in halls where time moved differently or did not move at all. Not death, but something held in suspension, a sleeping, a waiting, a healing that might take centuries or might already be complete. Earlier texts hint at the same journey through darker glass. The Annal Cambria, a 10th century Welsh chronicle, mentions only that Arthur fell at Camlan around the year 537, offering no details of what came after. But the silence itself feels pregnant with meaning, as if the chronicler knew stories too sacred or too strange to commit to the historical record. The Welsh triads speak of Arthur's grave as one of 3, concealed graves of Britain hidden so that enemies could not desecrate his remains, or perhaps hidden because there was no grave to find. A mystery is Arthur's grave, one poem declares, leaving open the possibility that the king never truly died at all. This motif of the wounded king who departs westward across water appears throughout Celtic mythology, predating Arthur by centuries. The Irish hero Cuchulainn, mortally wounded, binds himself to a standing stone so he can die upright, and his soul departs across the sea. Bran the Blessed, in the Mabinogion, is mortally wounded in Ireland and commands his companions to cut off his head and bear it to the White Mount in London. But not before they spend 80 years feasting in the otherworld, where time stands still. The direction always west holds significance in Celtic cosmology. The setting sun marked the boundary between the mortal world and the realm of spirits. Islands to the west were threshold places, where the living might encounter the dead, where heroes might escape the ordinary constraints of mortality. Yet the genius of the Avalon legend lies in its careful ambiguity. Arthur is not described as dead, but as resting, healing, waiting. The Latin phrase, hic iacet Arthurus rex quandam rex futurus, here lies Arthur, the once and future king, captures this perfectly. He has been king. He will be king again. The historical past and the prophesied future meet in a present that is perpetual suspension. This promise of return transforms tragedy into hope. Britain, having fallen into chaos after Arthur's departure, need not despair. The great king sleeps in Avalon until the hour of Britain's greatest need, when he will wake and return to save his people once more. It is a promise that has sustained British identity through invasions, occupations, and centuries of transformation. The dream that somewhere beyond the mist, the king still waits, and healing is still possible. In the boat that carried Arthur to Avalon, 3 queens stood as guardians of the threshold between life and death. At their head, Morgan called Le Fay, the fairy, the enchantress, whose hands held knowledge of healing arts that seemed to transcend the merely herbal, touching something more fundamental about the nature of life itself. Geoffrey of Monmouth names her Morgan the physician, writing that she excelled all her sisters in the arts of healing and transformation. She could fly through the air in strange forms, it was said, and possessed knowledge of the properties of all plants, including those that grew only in the otherworld. But was she goddess, witch, woman, or something that defies such simple categorization? The Morgan of later medieval romance becomes increasingly darkened Arthur's half-sister, his betrayer, a sorceress of ambiguous morality. But these Christian-era retellings may be deliberately obscuring something older, something that the new faith found threatening. Look past the medieval corruption of her character, and hints of her original nature emerge. In Celtic tradition before Christianity's arrival, the divine was often female, and healing was the province of goddess figures who commanded both life and death. The Irish Morrigan, whose name means phantom queen, was a goddess of war and fate, but also of sovereignty and the land itself. The Welsh Modron Great Mother appears in ancient texts as a divine ancestress whose name echoes in Morgan's own. 9 sisters dwelt on Avalon, according to the earliest accounts. 9 a number sacred in Celtic numerology, appearing again and again in their myths and magical practices. 9 waves in the sea, 9 sacred trees, 9 nights of ritual. These 9 women of Avalon possess knowledge of the stars, the properties of healing plants, the manipulation of weather, and the art of shapeshifting. They answered to no king or earthly authority, but governed themselves and the island according to laws far older than Arthur's kingdom. The description evokes comparison with other legendary communities of women, the Vestal Virgins of Rome, who tended the sacred fire and whose virginity guaranteed the safety of the state. The priestesses of the oracle at Delphi, who channeled divine prophecy while seated above volcanic fumes. The historical druidesses of Gaul, described by Roman writers as women who lived apart from society, devoted to religious mysteries and possessing the gift of prophecy. Were these 9 sisters of Avalon the last remnant of such a druidic tradition? When Roman legions crushed the Druid stronghold on Anglesey in 60 CE, the historian Tacitus described women in black robes standing among the defenders, calling down curses on the invaders. Did some escape? Did they retreat to hidden sanctuaries where the old ways might be preserved? The island sanctuary makes particular sense in this context. Celtic spiritual practice often centered on liminal spaces, groves, springs, and especially islands. Irish monasteries, even after Christianization, were frequently established on islands, perhaps unconsciously echoing older patterns. Iona, Skellig Michael, Lindisfarne each became famous as a place apart, where the sacred could be protected from the chaos of the mortal world. Morgan and her sisters, then, might represent the memory of a time when spiritual authority resided in women who mastered the mysteries of healing and transformation. The apple trees of Avalon, perhaps a reference to sacred groves where priestesses trained in botanical medicine, creating remedies so effective they seemed magical to those unfamiliar with their properties. But there's another layer to consider. In many mythological traditions, the divine feminine is explicitly linked to the land itself. Morgan, as sovereign of Avalon, would make her not just priestess, but the living embodiment of the island, its spirit made flesh. To heal on Avalon would be to be healed by the goddess herself, to rest in the arms of the Divine Mother. This interpretation gains weight when we consider how thoroughly Christian authorities worked to discredit and demonize feminine spiritual power. Saints' lives from the conversion period are filled with stories of male saints defeating witches and hags, who are almost certainly memories of pagan priestesses. The transformation of Morgan from healing goddess to dangerous enchantress follows this same pattern, the deliberate corruption of what could not be completely erased. Centuries after the age of Arthur, Avalon's priestesses lingered in folk memory. Cunning women, herb wives, wise women, those who lived at the edge of villages and possessed healing knowledge that had been passed down through generations of women, hidden in the gaps of official male-dominated medicine. Perhaps they were the distant descendants, the scattered inheritors, of the 9 sisters who once ruled an island that has vanished beneath the mists of time. Britain in the 5th and 6th centuries, the time when Arthur, if he existed, would have lived, was a land caught between worlds. The Roman legions had departed, leaving behind roads that still stretched straight across the countryside, but now led nowhere. Cities whose stone walls enclosed diminishing populations. Into this vacuum, new forces pressed. Saxon invaders from across the sea, and from the continent, a religion that would transform not just belief, but the very structure of reality itself. Christianity had been present in Britain since Roman times. The martyrdom of Saint Alban around 250 CE attests to that, but it remained one religion among many, coexisting with older ways. Celtic deities still received offerings at sacred wells and groves. The turning of seasons was marked by festivals whose origins stretched back to the Bronze Age. The landscape itself was alive with spirits. Every hill had its guardian, every spring its nymph, every ancient oak its resident power. The Christian missionaries who arrived in this Britain understood that they faced not a simple replacement of old gods with new, but something far more complex, a worldview in which the sacred and mundane intertwined constantly, where the boundary between physical and spiritual was understood to be permeable, crossable. The pagan Celts didn't worship their gods in temples set apart from daily life, but encountered them in every aspect of existence. The Church's strategy was subtle and profound. Rather than attempt to eradicate the old beliefs entirely, a task likely impossible, the missionaries worked to overlay, reinterpret, and gradually transform. Sacred wells became the sites of saints' miracles. Ancient goddesses were reimagined as early Christian martyrs. The great festivals of the Celtic year were given new meanings. Imbolc became St. Bridget's Day, Samhain transformed into All Saints and All Souls. The old gods didn't disappear. They put on new faces, spoke new names, but beneath the surface, something of the original power remained. Avalon existed precisely in this tension. As a pagan sanctuary, a place where goddess worship continued, where healing arts that predated Christianity flourished, it represented everything the new faith sought to supplant. Yet the power of the place, the spiritual authority it commanded, couldn't simply be erased. So Avalon began to shift in the cultural imagination. The 9 sisters became simultaneously less and more than they had been. No longer openly named as priestesses of the goddess, they became fey creatures, fairies, beings of ambiguous morality who existed in a realm parallel to Christian Britain. Morgan retained her healing power, but gained a reputation for deception, for enchantment in the negative sense. The island itself began to be described not as a sacred sanctuary, but as a place of dangerous magic, beautiful but potentially corrupting. Yet even as the Christian narrative worked to contain or diminish Avalon, the new faith couldn't help but be drawn to the symbolic power of the place. The Welsh monk Gildas, writing in the 6th century, railed against British rulers for clinging to pagan ways. But even his complaints reveal how thoroughly the old and new were entangled. Arthur himself, in most later traditions, is portrayed as a Christian king, bearing the image of Mary on his shield, fighting in defense of Christian Britain against pagan Saxons. Yet his final destination is Avalon, that most pagan of places. This contradiction reveals something essential about the British psyche during these centuries of transformation. Identity was being renegotiated, and Arthur, wounded, suspended between life and death, dwelling in a place that was neither fully mortal nor divine, became the perfect symbol of a people caught between two worlds. Glastonbury Abbey, which would later claim to be the site of Avalon, embodies this synthesis. The abbey was built on a site that had been sacred for millennia before Christianity arrived. Local legends insisted that Joseph of Arimathea himself had come there, bearing the Holy Grail, and that he had planted his staff, which grew into the Glastonbury thorn, a tree that bloomed twice yearly, at Christmas and Easter, as if nature itself confirmed the Christian calendar. Was this story true, or was it a brilliant myth-making that allowed the new faith to claim legitimacy by association with Avalon's ancient power? The monks of Glastonbury certainly benefited from the association. Pilgrims brought wealth, and the abbey became one of the richest in England. But perhaps the distinction between truth and story misses the point. What happened in these centuries of transformation wasn't simply one set of beliefs defeating another. It was a far stranger and more organic process, a blending, a hybridization, in which the old gods didn't die but went underground, continuing to live in folk customs, in place names, in the structure of festivals, and the turn of the year. Avalon, that island beyond the mists, became in Christian Britain a symbol of what had been lost, the direct access to the sacred that paganism had provided. The island had to recede from the world because the world itself was changing, because the veil that had been thin was being deliberately thickened by a religion that insisted on clear boundaries between heaven and earth, sacred and profane, saint and sinner. As the Christian dawn grew brighter, Avalon faded into the mist, not destroyed, but displaced into a realm of memory and dream, waiting perhaps for a time when the veil might thin once more. The town of Glastonbury rises from the Somerset levels like a memory made solid. Ancient buildings, leaning against each other for support, narrow streets that follow medieval paths, and at the center the ruins of an abbey whose empty Gothic arches frame the sky as if holding open a doorway to something beyond. For more than 800 years, Glastonbury has claimed a unique identity. It is Avalon, or it was Avalon, or perhaps it occupies the same spiritual space that Avalon once inhabited. The assertion is impossible to prove, and equally impossible to disprove, which may be precisely why it endures. The history is tangled, deliberately so. In 1191, the monks of Glastonbury Abbey announced an extraordinary discovery: the grave of King Arthur and Queen Guinevere, located between two ancient pyramids in the Abbey cemetery. According to their account, excavation revealed a coffin made from a hollowed oak log, and within it the bones of an unusually large man and a woman whose golden hair disintegrated at the touch of air. Most compelling of all, they claimed to have found a lead cross bearing the Latin inscription, Hic ius et sepultus inclitus rex Arthurus in Insula Avalonia. Here lies buried the renowned King Arthur in the Isle of Avalon. The timing was, skeptics note, remarkably convenient. The abbey had suffered a devastating fire in 1184, and the discovery of Arthur's grave brought a sudden surge in pilgrim traffic and donations. The tomb became one of medieval England's most popular pilgrimage destinations, a source of revenue that helped rebuild the abbey in ever grander style. The lead cross has since vanished, known only from drawings made before its disappearance. The bones, displayed for centuries in a black marble tomb before the high altar, were scattered during Henry VIII as dissolution of the monasteries in 1539. Without physical evidence to examine with modern techniques, we are left with medieval accounts that might be genuine or might be pious fraud or something more. Complicate than either category allows. Yet Glastonbury's claim to be Avalon rests on more than a convenient medieval discovery. The geography itself suggests something deeper. The Tor, that distinctive conical hill rising 518 feet above the levels, would have been an island during the wet winters and high water levels of the post-Roman period. Surrounding marshes and channels would have made it accessible only by boat or via causeway paths known to locals. Approaching across the water on a misty morning, travelers would have seen it appear to float between earth and sky, exactly the sort of place that might earn a reputation as an entrance to the otherworld. The Tor itself bears marks of human activity stretching back into prehistory. The terraces that spiral around its slopes appear to be partially artificial, either defensive earthworks or perhaps the remnants of a processional maze, a ritual pathway leading to whatever stood at the summit in ancient times. A church dedicated to Saint Michael now crowns the peak, but it sits atop layers of earlier use whose purposes can only be guessed. Glastonbury springs add another layer of mystery. The Chalice Well, with its iron-red water flowing from deep beneath the Tor, has been considered sacred for thousands of years. The water's reddish color, caused by iron oxide, led to legends that it flowed from the Holy Grail itself, buried somewhere beneath the Tor after Joseph of Arimathea brought it from Jerusalem. Another spring, the White Spring, emerges nearby, its waters milky with calcite. Two springs, red and white, symbolizing blood and milk, the masculine and feminine principles, flowing from the heart of Avalon. The town itself cultivates its mystical reputation with an interesting mix of commercialism and genuine spiritual seeking. High Street hosts shops selling crystals, tarot readings, goddess figurines, and books on ley lines beside ordinary grocers and cafes. During the summer solstice, the Tor is crowded with spiritual pilgrims greeting the sunrise, much as their prehistoric ancestors might have done, though with yoga mats instead of ritual bronze. But beneath the New Age veneer, something genuine persists, a sense that this place has been considered sacred for so long that the land itself retains some imprint of all that focused intention. Archaeologists have found evidence of Neolithic and Bronze Age settlement. The lake villages of the Somerset levels show sophisticated societies thriving here 3,000 years ago. Whatever made this place special wasn't invented by medieval monks. They were building on foundations laid in ages beyond memory. The question of whether Glastonbury is Avalon may be approaching the matter from the wrong direction. Perhaps the better question is whether any single physical location could ever fully embody a mythic idea as potent as Avalon. Glastonbury claims the title, but so do other sites across Britain and Brittany. Maybe Avalon was always less about geography than about the human need to believe that somewhere just beyond the visible world, better place exists, a land where wounds are healed, where wisdom is preserved, where the best of what was lost might still be found by those who know how to look. Glastonbury keeps that possibility alive, and for that reason alone, perhaps it has earned the right to be called Avalon, not because Arthur's bones truly rested there, but because for centuries, pilgrims have journeyed there, carrying the same hope that accompanied the wounded king across the water. That healing is possible, that magic endures, that the mist might part for those who seek with genuine hearts. There is an orchard in the oldest stories, where trees bloom regardless of season, where fruit ripens under impossible skies, where the cycle of growth and decay that governs the mortal world holds no dominion. These are the apple trees of Avalon, and they carry more meaning in their branches than any botanical classification could contain. The apple, in the symbolic vocabulary of ancient peoples, is never merely fruit. It is potential made manifest, the sphere that contains within its flesh the seeds of its own renewal, death, and rebirth, held in perfect balance, wrapped in skin so thin you could almost see through it to the truth beneath. In Greek myth, the Garden of the Hesperides grew golden apples that granted immortality, guarded by a dragon who never slept and nymphs who sang as the sun set beyond the edge of the world. Heracles, in his 11th labor, had to journey there and bring back the fruit, a task so difficult it could only be accomplished by the greatest of heroes. For the garden existed at the boundary of the world, where mortal geography gave way to divine mystery. Norse mythology speaks of Icon, goddess who kept apples in a wooden box fruit that the gods consumed to maintain their youth and vigor. When Icon was kidnapped and her apples unavailable, the gods began to age rapidly, growing gray and weak until she could be rescued. Immortality, in this tradition, wasn't inherent but required constant renewal through the consumption of magical fruit. The Celts, whose myths inform Avalon most directly, saw apples as gateways between worlds. The silver branch bearing white apple blossoms served as a passport to the otherworld in Irish tales. Shake the branch, and its music would lull mortals into enchantment, opening their perception to realms normally invisible. The Irish otherworld paradise was called Imain Ablec, the same meaning as Avalon, the Isle of Apple Trees, where heroes feasted eternally and beautiful maidens served mead that never emptied the cup. But there's another apple tradition woven into Avalon's story, one less immediately magical, but perhaps more profound: the actual cultivation of apples in ancient Britain. The Romans, during their occupation, brought sophisticated fruit-growing techniques to the island. They established orchards and developed varieties suited to Britain's climate. Some of these apples were cider apples, small and bitter, transformed through fermentation into drink that was safer than water and lasted through winter. In Somerset and Glastonbury's region, orchards became central to both economy and identity. The flooded levels made grain cultivation challenging, but apple trees thrived on the slightly higher ground. Cider became the drink of the people, and the apple harvest marked a crucial moment in the yearly cycle, the preserving of summer's sweetness against winter's lean months. Could Avalon's legendary orchards have originated in the memory of actual apple groves surrounding sacred sites? Imagine an island sanctuary in the marsh, approached only by those who knew the way, where priestesses tended both the spiritual health of visitors and productive apple trees that provided food, medicine, and ceremonial drink. The boundaries between the practical and mystical were never as clear in the ancient world as we imagine them today. Apple wood was prized for specific properties. It burns hot and clean, releasing a sweet smoke perfect for smoking foods or for ritual purposes. Apple bark and leaves contain compounds used in traditional medicine. The fruit itself, properly stored in a cool, dark place, can last through winter, seeming to preserve summer within its flesh. Perhaps most intriguing is the practice of wassailing the apple trees, a midwinter ceremony still performed in some Somerset villages. Farmers gather in the orchard after dark, make offerings of cider-soaked toast placed in the branches, and sing songs to wake the trees and ensure a good harvest. The ceremony has Christian veneer, but feels far older, a ritual that speaks to the human need to honor and communicate with the living world. In Avalon's orchards, the trees bloom eternally, but what if eternally is simply the mythic transformation of something more subtle? What if the magic lies not in literal flowers that never fade, but in the recognition that the cycle itself is eternal? That each year the trees do bloom again, that the fruit does return, that the pattern continues in a cycle that predates humanity and will likely outlast us? There's a kind of immortality in that, not the individual tree, which eventually falls, but the grove, the orchard, the tradition of cultivation passed from generation to generation. The apple seeds planted by Roman soldiers 2,000 years ago are the ancestors of trees bearing fruit today. That lineage, That green thread running through centuries might be Avalon's true promise. Not that death can be escaped, but that life continues, renewing itself in forms both familiar and transformed. The apples of Avalon, then, are neither entirely literal nor entirely symbolic. They exist in that space between real trees growing on real ground, but charged with meaning that transcends botany, embodying the human hope that somewhere, in some form, the paradise we dream of might actually grow, bearing fruit that tastes of immortality for those blessed enough to find it. The concept of healing in the ancient world was something far more comprehensive than our modern division between medicine and magic acknowledges. When the wounded Arthur was borne to Avalon to be healed by Morgan and her sisters, the treatment he would receive encompassed dimensions our contemporary hospitals would struggle to name, let alone address. Consider what healing meant to a Celtic priestess trained in the old ways. Yes, there would be knowledge of plants, which leaves drew poison from wounds, which roots eased pain, which flowers brewed into tea could bring sleep or vivid dreams. But this botanical wisdom existed within a larger framework that understood the patient as something more than a physical body requiring mechanical repair. Modern archaeology has revealed that Celtic and pre-Celtic peoples of Britain possessed sophisticated medical knowledge. Trepanned skulls showing evidence of surgical holes drilled into the cranium have been found dating back to Neolithic times, and bone growth around the holes proves that many patients survived the procedure, living for years afterward. The level of skill required to open a human skull without killing the patient suggests a depth of anatomical knowledge and surgical precision that challenges assumptions about primitive medicine. Herbal pharmacology was extensive and effective. Many plants used in traditional British medicine have been verified by modern chemistry to contain active compounds that justify their historical applications. Willow bark, used for millennia to treat pain and fever, contains salicylic acid, the precursor to aspirin. Foxglove, used carefully by wise women to treat heart conditions, contains digitalis, still used in cardiac medicine today. The challenge for ancient healers wasn't the absence of effective drugs, but the difficulty of determining proper dosages and avoiding toxicity. But Avalon-S healers would have employed methods that go beyond pharmacology into territories modern medicine has largely abandoned. Sound, for instance, was understood as a healing force. The Welsh medical text Physicians of Mid-Fi, compiled in the 13th century from far older sources, recommends specific melodies and tones for treating different conditions. The vibration of the human voice, of stringed instruments, of bells and chimes, all were considered to have direct effects on the body's internal balance. Water therapy would have been central to Avalon's practices. The sacred springs, hot and cold, iron-rich and mineral-laden, each with specific properties. Bathing in sacred waters wasn't simply hygiene, but ritual transformation, washing away illness or curse, emerging renewed. The modern spa industry unknowingly echoes these ancient practices, though stripped of their spiritual context. Color and light were therapeutic tools. Certain illuminations were believed to carry healing properties: the soft light of dawn, the glow of fire, the dappled light filtering through leaves. Patients might be placed in chambers designed to catch specific qualities of light at particular times of day or year. Modern chromotherapy has attempted to revive some of these ideas, though whether current applications match the sophistication of ancient practices remains unknown. Touch, the laying on of hands, carried significance beyond simple comfort. Celtic healers understood that human contact could transfer vitality from one person to another, that the intention and focus of the healer was as crucial as any medicine administered. Modern medicine is slowly rediscovering the measurable effects of human touch on heart rate, pain perception, and recovery speed. Crystal and stone therapy seems fantastic to the modern mind, yet the practice may have origins in observable phenomena. Certain stones do possess properties we now recognize. Lodestone's magnetism, Quartz's piezoelectric effects, the way specific minerals resonate at particular frequencies. Whether ancient healers understood the physics or simply observed the effects, they incorporated stones into healing practices with careful specificity, not randomly, but according to systems whose logic we've largely lost. Perhaps most important was the healing environment itself. Avalon, as described in legend, would have been designed for recovery isolated from the stress and danger of ordinary life, surrounded by beauty, permeated with an atmosphere of peace and timelessness. Modern research confirms what ancient healers knew, that environment profoundly affects healing. Stress hormones slow recovery, while feelings of safety, beauty, and calm accelerated. A sanctuary like Avalon, where every element was designed to promote healing, would have had measurable medical benefits even before any specific treatment began. The knowledge systems that produced such healing weren't written in books, but passed down through apprenticeship, observation, and what we might call clinical trial, though without double-blind protocols or control groups. A wise woman would learn from her predecessor through years of practice, accumulating both technical knowledge and the intuitive sense of when to apply which treatment. When Christianity suppressed the old ways, much of this medical knowledge was lost or driven underground. Practices that couldn't be explained in Christian theological terms were labeled as witchcraft. Women who practiced traditional medicine were increasingly suspect, and by the late medieval period, healing knowledge that had been respected for millennia became grounds for persecution. Some of Avalon's healing arts survived in folk medicine, in practices labeled as old wives' tales, many of which modern research has validated. Some knowledge was preserved by the very monasteries that officially opposed pagan practices, monks quietly copying down herbal recipes and medical treatments in the margins of religious texts. But something essential was lost when healing became divorced from its spiritual context, when medicine became solely about the body and religion about the soul. The Avalon healers would have found this division incomprehensible. For them, all healing was sacred work, and all sacred work involved healing, mending the ruptures between body and spirit, individual and community, human and land, mortal and divine. The legend of Arthur healing in Avalon, then, speaks to a kind of medicine we've largely forgotten how to practice, one that addresses not just the wound in his side, but the deeper injuries to his soul, his purpose, his connection to the kingdom he failed to save. That kind of healing might indeed take centuries, might require an entire island dedicated to the work, might exist in a time outside time, because linear morality is too brief for transformation so profound. Morning on the Somerset levels begins with transformation. As the sun climbs, heat meets the cool breath of water-soaked land, and the air itself becomes visible silver, luminous, thick enough to feel against the skin. Within minutes, a landscape that stretched clear to the horizon vanishes, replaced by a world reduced to a few feet in any direction. Sound changes too muffled, directional cues scrambled, so that a voice might seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Science explains this readily enough. Temperature inversions trap cool, moist air close to the ground. Water vapor condenses into droplets small enough to remain suspended in air, each droplet refracting light, creating the optical effect we call fog or mist. The phenomenon is perfectly natural, predictable given the right atmospheric conditions, devoid of mystery once you understand the physics. Yet standing in such mist, watching familiar landmarks disappear and strange shapes emerge, the scientific explanation feels insufficient. The mist doesn't just hide the landscape, it seems to replace it with something else, to open possibilities that didn't exist in the clear light of ordinary day. Celtic tradition spoke of thin places, locations where the boundary between the mortal world and the other world were thin enough to cross. Islands surrounded by water were naturally thin places, but mist could create temporary thinness anywhere, a veil that marked the threshold between realms. To enter deep mist was to enter a liminal space where the normal rules might not apply, where you might encounter beings or places that existed alongside the ordinary world, but were usually hidden from sight. Modern accounts from the Somerset levels preserve strange stories that echo these older beliefs. Farmers report seeing buildings where none should exist, medieval structures appearing for moments before the mist shifts and reveals modern fields. Drivers on narrow roads claim to have followed vehicles that vanish at intersections, or seen figures in historical dress walking across roads before disappearing. Are these hallucinations, tricks of light and expectation? Or does something about these landscapes and their thick mists genuinely affect perception in ways we don't fully understand? There are natural phenomena that might contribute to such experiences beyond simple fog. Marsh gas methane released from decaying vegetation in wetlands can create eerie lights, called will-o'-the-wisps or ignis fatuus. These floating lights have lured travelers off safe paths for centuries, following what appears to be a lantern carried by someone ahead, only to find themselves lost in treacherous bog. The gases themselves can be mildly hallucinogenic in certain concentrations, potentially affecting perception and judgment. Infrasound sound waves below the range of human hearing occurs naturally in certain landscapes and can cause feelings of unease, presence, or being watched. Some researchers suggest that infrasound might even cause visual hallucinations, as the vibrations affect the eyeball itself. Could the unique geography and weather patterns of places like the Somerset levels generate infrasound conditions that contributed to their reputations as mystical or haunted? But there's another layer to consider, one that bridges the natural and the esoteric. Quantum physics has revealed that observation itself affects reality at the subatomic level, the famous double-slit experiment, proving that particles behave differently when observed than when unobserved. If consciousness and physical reality interact at fundamental levels in ways we're only beginning to understand, might there be something to the old belief that certain states of consciousness, meditative, ritual, or altered, can perceive aspects of reality normally hidden? The mist, in this interpretation, doesn't create the portal but facilitates it. By removing visual stimuli, by forcing consciousness to turn inward, by creating sensory conditions that disrupt normal cognitive patterns, thick fog might actually shift perception in ways that allow glimpses of, what? Other dimensions? Aspects of our own dimension, usually filtered out by the brain's need to process only immediately relevant information? The collective unconscious made briefly visible? Glastonbury Tor, shrouded in mist, appears to float an island suspended between earth and sky. The visual effect is literal and physical, explainable by refraction and atmospheric conditions. But the psychological and spiritual effect might be equally real. The sight triggers something deep in human consciousness, a recognition that resonates with archetypes older than language. The floating island, the mountain in the mist, these images appear in myths worldwide because they speak to something fundamental about human perception of the sacred. Tibetan Buddhism speaks of Shambhala, a hidden kingdom concealed by mountains and mist, accessible only to those with spiritual development sufficient to perceive it. Japanese legends describe Horai, the island of immortals, perpetually surrounded by fog that parts only for the worthy. The Greek Hesperides existed beyond the mists at the world's edge. Again and again, human cultures associate mist-shrouded islands or mountains with spiritual transformation and hidden wisdom. Perhaps the mist of Avalon operates on multiple levels simultaneously. On the physical level, it's the natural fog of the Somerset wetlands, hiding and revealing according to atmospheric conditions. On the psychological level, it's a catalyst for altered states of consciousness, the sensory deprivation that allows internal visions to seem external. On the mythic level, it's the boundary marker of the otherworld, the signal that ordinary rules of space and time no longer apply. And perhaps, though, this requires a leap beyond what current science can support. On some level, we don't yet have instruments to measure. The mist marks genuine boundaries in the fabric of reality itself. Not literal portals in the science fiction sense, but places where the structure of spacetime is subtly different, where human consciousness encounters conditions that allow perception of possibilities usually excluded from awareness. The veil of mist remains as it has always been, a perfect symbol of the mystery itself, something you can see and touch, whose existence is undeniable, yet whose true nature remains elusive. Walk into it, and the solid world dissolves. Wait, and it parts, revealing landscapes you recognize, but which somehow seem changed, as if you're seeing them for the first time, or remembering them from a dream you can't quite recall. Avalon lies beyond such mist, the legends say. Not north or south, east or west, but in a direction that might be inward, or sideways, or through. The mist is both obstacle and invitation. It hides the island from those who shouldn't find it. But for those who know how to see, it marks the way home. Still water has haunted human imagination since our ancestors first caught their own reflections, staring back from a forest pool. That moment of recognition, the self, seen as other, carries a peculiar power that philosophy has yet to fully explain. The lake becomes mirror, and in that mirroring, something more than simple reflection occurs. Celtic tradition made little distinction between water and gateway. Lakes, rivers, springs, all were understood as boundaries between this world and the one beneath, beside, or beyond it. The offerings cast into lakes from the Bronze Age onward, swords, shields, turquoise of twisted gold, weren't gifts thrown away, but deliveries to another realm, passed through the water's surface into hands that waited on the other side. The most famous of these watery thresholds is the lake from which Excalibur emerged and to which it was returned. The Lady of the Lake, that mysterious figure who appears in Arthurian legend bearing the sword that will make a king, occupies a space between human and otherworldly. She rises from beneath the water, extends the blade, and descends again, leaving no explanation, no instruction manual, only the weapon itself and the destiny it carries. Was she goddess, fairy, or something that predates both categories? The text calls her a lady, using the terminology of medieval nobility, but everything about her suggests something older, a remnant of those water deities that Celtic and pre-Celtic peoples honored at every significant body of water. The nymphs of Greek tradition, the nixies of Germanic folklore, the undines of alchemical philosophy, all point to the same recognition that water is alive, inhabited, watching. At the end of Arthur's life, when his wounds no longer allow him to carry Excalibur, he commands Sir Bedivere to return it to the lake. Bedivere hesitates twice. He hides the sword and returns claiming to have done the deed. But Arthur knows he is lying and insists. Finally, Bedivere hurls the blade over the water, and a hand rises from the depths to catch it. Not the lady herself this time, but an arm clothed in white samite, mystic, wonderful, that catches the sword, brandishes it 3 times, and draws it beneath the surface. The image is so perfect, so complete, that it feels inevitable. Of course, the sword that came from the lake must return to the lake. Of course, a hand must rise to receive it, acknowledging the completion of a cycle. The symmetry satisfies something deeper than narrative logic. It feels like truth, even if it never happened. But why a lake? Why not a mountaintop, a cave, a burial mound? Because the lake, unlike solid earth or open air, is a membrane, a surface that separates while simultaneously connecting. Standing at a lakeshore, you're at the edge of 2 worlds. Above the water, the realm of air and fire, thought and action. Below, the realm of earth and water, dream and dissolution. The surface between them reflects the sky, confusing above and below, making it impossible to say which world is the reflection of which. Irish mythology is filled with lakes that conceal entire worlds beneath their surface. Tech Duin, the house of the dead god Dawn, lies beneath the waves off the western coast. The Tuatha Dé Danann, when displaced by mortal salts, retreated into the side. The hollow hills and underwater realms that exist parallel to the human world. To enter a lake in Celtic tradition was to risk never returning, or returning so changed the home would never fit again. The practice of depositing valuable objects in water persists across cultures and millennia. The sacred cenote at Chichen Itza in Mexico, where Maya priests cast gold and jade and occasionally human offerings. The Trevi Fountain in modern Rome, where tourists throw coins with wishes attached. The phenomenon suggests something deeper than superstition, a persistent human intuition that water receives and remembers, that what we give to the depths doesn't disappear, but transforms into something else. Science offers its own mysteries about water that echo these intuitive beliefs. Water's molecular structure creates properties that remain incompletely understood. Its ability to store information in its crystalline structure when frozen, the way its surface tension creates a genuine membrane with distinct properties from the liquid below. Its role as universal solvent and medium for life itself. Masaru Emoto's controversial experiments claimed that water crystals respond to human intention and emotion, forming beautiful or chaotic patterns based on the thoughts directed toward them. While mainstream science remains skeptical, the research points toward possibilities that blur the line between the physical and consciousness. Standing at the edge of the lake that concealed Avalon, or standing at any lake in Britain's ancient landscape, our ancestors would have seen more than water. They would have seen the dwelling place of powers that could grant or withhold, heal or drown, reveal or conceal. Approaching such a lake wasn't simply travel but ritual, requiring the proper mindset, the correct offerings, the respectful attitude that acknowledged you were a guest in a realm not your own. The mists that rose from these waters weren't just weather, but breath, the exhalation of whatever lived beneath. When Arthur's boat carried him across the lake toward Avalon, he wasn't traveling over water, but through it, passing from one state of being to another with the lake's surface as the moment of transition. On one side, the mortal king dying from his wounds. On the other, something no longer quite human, suspended in a healing that might be eternal. The mirror of the lake, then, is not simply reflecting what stands before it. It's showing the other side, the hidden version, the truth beneath appearance, the world that exists in the space between breath and heartbeat, between waking and sleep, between one moment and the next. Look into still water long enough, and you might see not your reflection, but your double, the version of you that exists in Avalon, whole and unbroken, waiting for you to remember how to cross. There are nights in the British countryside when the wind carries sounds that don't quite match the visible world music that seems to come from beneath the earth, harmonies too perfect to be entirely human, melodies that make the heart ache with a longing for something it has never known but somehow remembers. The local people, when such sounds occur, know better than to investigate too closely. These are the voices from the hollow hills. They say the music of those who dwell in the realm beneath, beside, or beyond the ordinary world. To hear such music is a gift and a curse, for once you've heard the songs of Avalon, the songs of the mortal world will never quite satisfy again. Welsh tradition speaks of the Tylwyth Teg, the fair folk, who live within hollow hills throughout the landscape. These aren't the tiny winged fairies of Victorian imagination, but something far more ambiguous beings of human stature or greater, beautiful and terrible, who exist according to laws and logic that parallel humanity's, but never quite align. Time moves differently in their realm. A night spent dancing with the fair folk might be 100 years in mortal time, so that the traveler who returns finds his village gone, his family long dead, and himself suddenly aging centuries in moments. Similar stories permeate Celtic lands. In Ireland, the Tuatha De Danann, the old gods themselves, retreated into the side mounds after being displaced by mortal settlers. They didn't die or disappear, but withdrew into a parallel existence, accessible through certain hills, at certain times, under certain conditions. Samhain and Beltane, the festivals marking summer's death and birth, were times when the boundaries thinned and traffic between worlds increased. The specific motif of sleeping heroes beneath hills appears across European folklore with remarkable consistency. Arthur sleeping in Avalon is paralleled by Frederick Barbarossa sleeping beneath Kyffhauser Mountain in Germany, awaiting the call to save his nation. Charlemagne sleeps in the Untersberg. Ogier the Dane rests beneath Kronborg Castle. In each case, the hero isn't dead, but suspended, maintaining a connection to the land so profound that they'll wake when need is greatest. These aren't simply pleasant stories, but expressions of something deeper, a belief that the past doesn't disappear, but continues to exist in layers beneath or alongside the present. The hollow hills are memory made physical, the persistence of what was into what is. Avalon, in this interpretation, is the hill beneath all hills, the hidden realm that all the others echo. But there are stranger elements to these traditions that resist simple metaphorical interpretation. Too many accounts, from too many periods, describe specific phenomena, the music, yes, but also lights seen within hills where no lights should be, doors that appear and disappear in hillsides, entire communities glimpsed for moments in landscapes before vanishing, leaving no trace except the witness's conviction that they saw something real. In Somerset, the Wookey Hole caves carry legends of a witch who lived in their depths a priestess. Some say of the old religion, who retreated underground when Christianity came and still dwells there in some form, guardian of the passages that lead deeper into the hill. The caves are real limestone caverns carved by underground rivers, but the legend persists that the mapped chambers are merely the beginning, that passages extend far deeper into the earth, to places where the stone itself might be less solid than it appears. The phenomenon of hearing music or voices from within hills has a physical explanation in some cases. Certain geological formations can channel sound in unexpected ways, carrying voices or water sounds from miles away through rock, emerging in locations that make the sound seem sourceless, otherworldly. Subterranean rivers create harmonics as they flow through caverns, producing tones that can sound remarkably like distant singing or instrumental music. But as with the mists, the physical explanation doesn't entirely explain the experience. The effect of hearing such sounds, particularly in darkness or in landscapes already charged with mythic significance, goes beyond the merely acoustic. It triggers something in consciousness, an opening to possibilities that rational daylight thinking automatically excludes. The practice of spending the night on or within sacred hills was common in Celtic tradition. Vision quests, prophetic dreams, encounters with otherworldly beings, all were more likely on hilltops or within ancient mounds. The discomfort of sleeping on stone or earth, the cold, the sounds of night all contributed to altered states of consciousness in which the boundary between inner vision and outer perception blurred. Modern archaeoacoustics, the study of sound in ancient sites, has revealed that Neolithic passage tombs were designed with acoustic properties that amplify and resonate at specific frequencies. Newgrange in Ireland, Meshow in Orkney, Wayland's Smithy in England all demonstrate sophisticated understanding of how sound behaves in enclosed stone spaces. Drumming or chanting in these chambers produces effects that are simultaneously physical and psychological, the vibrations resonating in bone and tissue, while the mind interprets the sound as coming from everywhere at once. Were these acoustic properties intentional? Did the builders of these structures understand that sound could facilitate communion with the otherworld, that the right frequencies could open perception to realms normally hidden? The precision of the construction suggests knowledge rather than accident, a sacred science of sound that later ages have only begun to rediscover. The voices from the hollow hills, then, might be many things simultaneously. They might be physical acoustic phenomena winged through caves, subterranean water, geological resonance. They might be psychological, the mind's interpretation of ambiguous sounds, filtered through cultural expectation and mythic framework. They might be genuinely mystical, the voices of those who dwell in Avalon and kindred realms, calling to those who have the ears to hear. Or perhaps the distinction between these possibilities is false, a modern insistence on categorical separation that the ancients would have found absurd. Perhaps the physical sound, the psychological effect, and the spiritual reality are simply different aspects of a unified phenomenon, the hollow hills speaking in a language that bypasses reason and speaks directly to something older, something that remembers when the veil was thinner and the worlds touched freely, when Avalon was not yet hidden and the voices from beneath the hills were answered by voices from above. Long before Arthur, before Rome, before even the Celts gave their names to these islands, there were astronomers. Not astronomers in the modern sense, white-coated scientists peering through telescopes, but watchers of the sky whose observations were simultaneously scientific and sacred, whose calendars tracked both practical agricultural needs and the movements of powers they understood to govern existence itself. The great stone circles of Britain and Ireland, Stonehenge most famous among them, but hundreds of others scattered across the landscape represent knowledge systems of stunning sophistication. Stonehenge's alignment to the summer solstice sunrise is well known, but its architectural complexity encodes far more information. Lunar cycles, eclipse predictions, solar declination tracking across centuries. The monument is simultaneously temple and computer, built in an age we habitually dismiss as primitive by people whose understanding of celestial mechanics rivaled anything achieved before the invention of the telescope. Avebury, the largest stone circle in Europe, encompasses an area so vast that the modern village sits within its bounds. Silbury Hill, the tallest prehistoric human-made mound in Europe, rises nearby for reasons that remain mysterious speculation, ranges from astronomical observation platform to symbolic representation of the cosmic mountain, the axis mundi connecting earth and sky. The landscape here is not merely inhabited but sculpted, transformed into a vast sacred geography whose purpose we can only partially reconstruct. Further west, in the country associated with Arthur, the stone circles continue, though smaller, often half reclaimed by earth and vegetation, easy to miss if you don't know where to look. But they're aligned with the same astronomical precision as their larger cousins, tracking the same cycles of sun and moon, marking the same sacred moments when earth and sky converse. What does this have to do with Avalon? Perhaps everything. If we imagine Avalon not as simple escape or healing sanctuary, but as the perfected version of what these stone circles attempted to create, a place where earth and heaven align completely, where human and cosmos exist in perfect harmony, then Avalon becomes the spiritual goal toward which all these monuments point. The island of eternal spring, where apple trees bloom regardless of season, would be a place freed from the tyranny of time as we experience it. But what if this wasn't fantasy, but memory or prophecy of a state of consciousness achieved through understanding and aligning with celestial patterns? The mysteries of Stonehenge and its kindred monuments might have been initiatory systems designed to elevate consciousness to a state where time was experienced differently, where the practitioner existed simultaneously in the linear progression of mortal life and the eternal now of the cosmos. Ancient mystery schools throughout the Mediterranean, Eleusis in Greece, the Orphic cults, the Pythagorean communities, all combined astronomical knowledge with spiritual practice. The celestial and terrestrial were understood to mirror each other, as above, so below, the axiom that would later become central to Hermetic philosophy. To understand the movements of stars and planets was to understand the structures of reality itself, and that understanding was transformative, literally changing the nature of the knower. The Druidic education system, according to classical sources like Julius Caesar and Strabo, required 20 years of training. Students memorized vast quantities of poetry and lore forbidden to write it down, preserving it only in human memory. But they also studied natural philosophy, the motions of heavenly bodies, the nature of the gods. The druids served as priests, yes, but also as judges, teachers, and scientists' roles we now separate, but which they understood as aspects of a unified knowledge system. If Avalon was a druidic center, as some theories suggest, it would have been a place where this knowledge was preserved and taught at the highest levels. The 9 sisters who dwelt there would have been priestesses certainly, but also astronomers, mathematicians, physicians, and philosophers. Women trained in the complete curriculum of sacred science, their healing powers deriving not from superstition, but from comprehensive understanding of how the cosmos functions and how human beings fit within that functioning. The alignment of sacred sites with celestial events creates moments of power times when the arrangement of sun, earth, and stone monuments creates conditions that were understood to facilitate communication between realms. The winter solstice dawn at Newgrange, when light penetrates the passage tomb to illuminate the inner chamber, was such a moment. For 17 minutes, the daily world is transfigured. The ordinary distinction between inside and outside, dark and light, death and life momentarily suspended. Perhaps Avalon existed in perpetual solstice, a place where the alignment was permanent rather than fleeting, where the condition that Stonehenge achieved for minutes, Avalon maintained eternally. The astronomical perfection that was glimpsed momentarily at the great monuments was the constant state on the hidden isle, and that perfection was what made healing possible, what allowed Arthur to exist outside time, what enabled the apple trees to bloom without regard for season. Modern research into ancient astronomy continues to reveal sophistication we're only beginning to appreciate. The Antikythera mechanism, recovered from a Roman-era shipwreck, proved that ancient Greeks had built geared computers capable of predicting celestial positions decades in advance. If Mediterranean cultures achieved such mechanical sophistication, what might the druids have developed using stone, wood, and living human memory as their computing medium? The astronomers of the Sacred Isles were mapping more than the sky. They were mapping the relationship between consciousness and cosmos, seeking to understand not just where celestial bodies move, what those movements mean, how they affect the subtle energies that govern life, health, death, and transformation. Avalon, in this context, becomes the place where that map was perfected, where theory became reality, where the cosmic order that the stone circles traced in earth and sky was embodied in a landscape that existed as much in the heavens as on the earth. The stars that turned above Avalon were the same stars that turned above Stonehenge, above Avebury, above every sacred site in Britain. But perhaps from Avalon, the stars were seen differently, not as distant lights, but as partners in a dance, not as objects to be observed, but as living presences with whom communion was possible, whose patterns weren't merely tracked, but understood in a language that combined mathematics with music, geometry with poetry, science with soul. The Britain that birthed the Avalon legend was not the Britain we know today. The climate, the coastline, the very character of the land had changed in ways both subtle and profound since. The age when Arthur historical or legendary might have ridden to battle against Saxon invaders. 10,000 years ago, as the last ice age released its grip on northern Europe, the landscape that would become Britain was transforming. Glaciers retreated, leaving behind a topography scoured and reshaped. Meltwater raised sea levels, eventually drowning the land bridge that had connected Britain to continental Europe, creating the island geography that would shape British identity for all subsequent history. But the transformation didn't end there. For thousands of years afterward, the climate continued to shift, sometimes warming, sometimes cooling, each change affecting vegetation patterns, water levels, and human settlement. The period from roughly 4000 to 2000 BC, the Neolithic and Bronze Ages, was significantly warmer than today. The tree line extended higher up mountains. Crops could be grown further north. The Somerset levels, while still marshy, may have been more navigable, with clearer seasonal patterns of flooding and drying. Then, around 800 BCE, as the Bronze Age gave way to the Iron Age, the climate cooled and, crucially, became wetter. Rainfall increased across northern Europe, bogs expanded. The carefully maintained field systems that had existed in upland areas were abandoned as the ground became too waterlogged for cultivation. Peat began to form over vast areas that had been farmland, preserving beneath its layers the evidence of the warmer, drier world that preceded it. This climatic shift had profound effects on human settlement and psychology. Communities that had thrived in upland areas were forced to descend to lower elevations. But the lowlands were increasingly dominated by expanding wetlands networks of marsh, mere, and fen that made travel difficult and settlement challenging. Islands and slightly elevated ground became precious real estate, and the culture adapted to a water-dominated landscape in ways that left deep marks on mythology and belief. The lake villages, discovered in the Somerset-level settlements, built on artificial islands, created by driving wooden piles into marsh bottoms and building platforms atop them, date to this wetter period. These communities lived surrounded by water, traveled primarily by boat, and developed an intimate relationship with the marsh ecosystem that sustained them. Fish, wildfowl, eels, reeds for thatching, and passage through otherwise impassable terrain all depended on understanding the rhythms and secrets of the wetlands. Such a world would naturally give birth to mythologies centered on islands, mists, and the boundary between land and water. When your daily experience involves landscapes that appear and disappear with seasonal flooding, when familiar paths can become impassable overnight, when mist reduces the world to a few feet of visibility with regularity, the physical and metaphysical begin to merge in ways that drier, more stable landscapes don't encourage. By the Roman period, the climate had stabilized somewhat, though Britain remained wetter and mistier than the Mediterranean homelands from which the conquerors came. Roman writers commented repeatedly on British weather, the rain, the fog, the damp that seemed to penetrate everything. They struggled to impose their grid-pattern roads and towns on a landscape that resisted such orderly geometry, where rivers changed course and marshes expanded or contracted unpredictably. The post-Roman period, precisely when Arthur would have lived, if he lived at all, saw another climatic downturn. The 6th century experienced what climate historians call the Late Antique Little Ice Age, triggered by massive volcanic eruptions, possibly Krakatoa in 535 CE and others, that injected enough particulate matter into the atmosphere to dim the sun and drop global temperatures. Tree ring data shows a decade or more reduced growth. Historical chronicles mention years without summers, failed harvests, and plague, though whether the famous plague of Justinian reached Britain remains uncertain. This climatic catastrophe coincides eerily with the Arthurian period. If Arthur existed, he lived and died during some of the worst weather Europe had experienced in centuries. The Britain he defended was cold, hungry, and shrouded in more than metaphorical darkness. The Saxon invasions that threatened Celtic Britain came during a period when climate change was displacing populations throughout Europe, forcing migrations that cascaded from the steppes of Asia all the way to Britain's shores. In such a world, the dream of Avalon takes on new meaning. An island of eternal spring, of apple orchards that never failed, of healing and plenty. This wasn't just spiritual metaphor, but desperate hope at an age of ecological catastrophe. The legend may preserve the memory of better times, warmer times, before the climate turned and the mists thickened and the land itself seemed to be drowning. The gradual drainage of Britain's wetlands over subsequent centuries accelerated dramatically in the medieval period and completed in the 18th and 19th centuries with industrial drainage schemes, transformed landscapes that had existed for millennia. The Somerset levels were systematically drained and converted to farmland. Islands that had been surrounded by water became ordinary hills. The physical conditions that made Avalon conceivable were erased, and the Island of Mists could retreat entirely into legend because the landscape that sustained such legends no longer existed except in remnant patches. Climate change today makes us newly sensitive to how profoundly environmental Conditions shape human culture and consciousness. Our ancestors weren't passive observers of their environment, but intimately connected to it. Their mythologies and identities formed by the land's character as much as by human choice. Avalon might be understood in part as the mythic memory of a landscape that no longer exists, drowned not by a single catastrophic flood, but by the slow transformation of climate over centuries, leaving only the story to mark where it had been. The mists that concealed Avalon, then, were the actual mists of a wetter, cooler Britain. The island, as disappearance, tracks with the draining of the marshes and the warming that made the landscape less prone to the thick fogs that had once hidden hills and made islands seem to float between worlds. The legend doesn't lie, but remembers truly. There was a time when such places existed, when the physical geography of Britain included spaces that felt genuinely apart from the ordinary world, and when those spaces vanished, drained, cleared, mapped, and measured, Avalon went with them, retreating to wherever lost landscapes go when the world no longer has room for them. The Celts, those people who spread across Europe from the Atlantic to the Black Sea, sharing language roots and cultural patterns, while never forming a unified empire, carried with them, wherever they settled, a particular understanding of reality. The world visible to ordinary eyes was only half the story. Parallel to it, interpenetrating with it, existed another realm, the other world, the She, the land of the ever-living, where time ran differently, and the rules that governed mortal existence bent or dissolved entirely. In Irish tradition, this otherworld had many names and many entrances. Tir na Nog, the land of the young, lay across the western sea, an island where aging ceased and death had no dominion. The hero Oisin traveled there with Niamh of the golden hair, spending what he believed were 3 weeks in perfect contentment before homesickness drew him back to Ireland. When he returned, 300 years had passed. The moment his foot touched mortal soil, the years claimed him all at once, and he crumbled to dust. Mag Mell, the Plain of Joy, was another name for the same or similar realm described in vivid terms that echo. Avalon, perpetual feasting, music of unbearable beauty, perfect health and contentment, so complete that those who reached it never wished to leave. The journey there often involved crossing water, sometimes physically, but sometimes in states that blurred the boundary between travel and vision, between movement through space and transformation of consciousness. Imain Aiblech, the Isle of Apple Trees, appears in Irish texts with the same meaning as Avalon, suggesting that the concept wasn't unique to Britain, but spread across the Celtic world wherever the tradition reached. The apple as marker of the otherworld, the island as threshold. These were pan-Celtic ideas that survived Christianization by adapting, hiding, and occasionally revealing themselves in saints' lives and monastic chronicles. In Breton tradition, the sunken city of Ez represents another version of the same archetype. Princess Dahat loved the city so much that she allegedly made a pact with dark powers to preserve it. But her father, King Gradland's chaplain, claimed the city's wickedness demanded divine punishment. When the sea walls were breached, whether by Goth's own hand, seduced by a demon, or by saint-provoked divine wrath, depending on the telling, the city drowned and Gradland barely escaped. But the legend insists that Ez still exists beneath the waves, perfectly preserved, and that on calm days you can hear its church bells ringing beneath the water. The parallels are too numerous and too specific to be coincidence. Celtic cultures from Ireland to Britain shared a mythology of hidden realms, particularly islands or cities that exist in a state between accessible and lost. Why this particular form? Why islands? Why mists? Why the emphasis on time flowing differently? Part of the answer lies in practical observation. Islands genuinely do exist in states of variable accessibility. Tides, weather, and seasons determine whether they can be reached. Anyone living in coastal or wetland Britain would be familiar with places that were islands part of the time and connected land otherwise, or that could be reached easily one day and not at all the next. This physical reality provided perfect metaphor for spiritual truth. Some places, some states of being, can only be accessed when conditions align properly. But there's something deeper too, a shared understanding of consciousness itself as existing in layers, with ordinary waking awareness being only one state among many. The otherworld was an imaginary, in the dismissive modern sense, but was understood as a genuine realm accessed through altered states of consciousness. Dreams, visions, trances induced by ritual, meditation, or entheogenic plants. In such states, time does behave differently. Dream time, trance time, the time of deep meditation or psychedelic journey, all operate according to logic that ordinary waking consciousness finds impossible. The Celtic druids, according to classical sources, taught the doctrine of reincarnation, not in the Eastern sense of souls migrating through species until achieving enlightenment, but in a specifically Celtic form, where the soul continued in the otherworld between earthly lives, experiencing adventures and transformations there that were as real as mortal existence, perhaps more so. The otherworld was an afterlife in the Christian sense, a destination reached only after death, but a parallel realm that could be visited during life, that interpenetrated with ordinary reality at certain times and places. Samhain, the festival marking the transition from summer to winter, and Beltane, marking winter's end and summer's beginning, were understood as times when the veil thinned. The boundaries between worlds became permeable, and traffic could move more freely in both directions. The dead could visit the living could glimpse the dead, and beings from the otherworld might enter mortal space. Modern Halloween preserves a shadow of these beliefs, though sanitized and commercialized beyond recognition. Welsh mythology, preserved in the Mabinogion and other texts, shows the same structures. Anwan, the Welsh otherworld, is ruled by a Ron, its king, who in one tale exchanges places with Pwyll, a mortal lord, for a year each, ruling the other's kingdoms so perfectly that no one notices the switch until the year ends and they exchange back. The point of the story isn't deception, but the permeability of the boundary, the possibility of movement between realms for those with the power and knowledge to manage it. Avalon fits perfectly into this cultic otherworld tradition. It is not an aberration or a unique invention, but the Arthurian expression of a pattern that echoes throughout Celtic culture. The island where time moves differently, where healing is possible because the ordinary rules of mortal flesh don't fully apply, where the wounded king waits in a state between death and life. This is quintessentially Celtic in conception, even though the stories were later written down by Christian monks and elaborated by medieval French romance writers. What the Celts understood, and what modern materialism struggles to accommodate, is that physical geography and spiritual geography can occupy the same space. Avalon might be Glastonbury and something else simultaneously. The otherworld might be accessible through a specific hill or well or island, but what you find there isn't simply under the hill, but in another mode of existence entirely. The location is simultaneously literal and metaphorical, physical and spiritual, occupying a space that our categories struggle to contain. The echoes from the Celtic otherworld that sound in Avalon-esque legend are echoes of a worldview. We've a largely lost one that did unseparate material from spiritual, that didn't insist on either or when both, and might be truer, that understood reality as richer and stranger than our daylight rationalism generally permits. To hear those echoes now requires a kind of listening that goes beyond the academic, beyond even the imaginative, to something more like remembering, not personal memory, but collective memory, the voice of ancestors speaking through stories they considered not entertainment, but essential truth about the nature of existence itself.